25 men in a single night. The number hangs in the foul air of a room that feels unreal, monstrous. The winner is not a desperate slave, nor a veteran courtesan. She is Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, wife of the divine Claudius, mother to the imperial heir. Tonight, in the foulest brothel of the Subura, the red light heart of Rome, she has just humiliated the city's most famous prostitute in a contest of endurance. The crowd of men, drunk on wine and disbelief, watches in silence as the Empress of the world becomes the servant of her own desire. But this was never about pleasure. It was about rebellion, a rebellion no legion could march for, no general could command. It was the silent uprising of a woman suffocating in silk. She does not moan, she breathes like a soldier. Every touch, every gasp, every motion is an act of war, against expectation, against decorum, against the invisible chains of empire. How could the woman who possessed everything, beauty, youth, power, and an empire, choose to fall this far? How could she risk the life of her child, the stability of Rome, for a night in the gutter? Because Messalina had learned what every ruler eventually learns. Power, when absolute, is not a blessing. It is a polished prison. It isolates, embalms, and drains the blood from the living. Tonight she wasn't chasing pleasure. She was chasing proof that she still existed beneath the titles. That somewhere, behind the laurel crown and the marble masks of the palace, there was still a heartbeat. And in that desperate act of flesh and fury, she crossed the invisible line that separates ruler from ruin. The Empress of Rome, the wife of a god, had become something far more dangerous, a woman who no longer feared consequence. Because once an empress learns she cannot be punished, she becomes something Rome itself cannot control. A free animal inside a golden cage ready to bite the hand that feeds her. At 23, Messalina had everything that could be seen. Power, jewels, youth, and the title that made every Roman bow in her presence. She slept beneath ceilings painted with gods, bathed in marble pools perfumed with saffron and rose oil, and dined on silver platters carved with her own image. Yet inside she was rotting. Her husband, Emperor Claudius, was a man the world underestimated, a scholar trapped in a body that betrayed him. He stuttered when he spoke, limped when he walked, and spent long hours bent over scrolls, more fascinated by aqueducts and census records than by his wife. Rome saw him as harmless. Messalina saw him as invisible. The palace of the Caesars was not a home, it was a machine, vast, gleaming and cold. Every whisper was a report, every servant an informant, every smile a mask. Messalina lived in a cage made not of iron but of gold, a cage polished so often it blinded her. In the mornings she tended ceremonies meant to glorify her virtue, the sacred mother of Rome, the new Venus reborn. In the evenings she sat alone, staring at the reflection of her crown in a bowl of water. The image shimmered, distorted, mocking. Claudius believed he had found stability after the storms of Caligula, but stability is a lie that cracks when touched. He had no idea that his young wife was sinking into madness, not the madness of blood, but of emptiness. In a world where every desire was instantly granted, desire itself became extinct. Messalina began to create her own risks. She whispered lies about senators to watch them sweat. She seduced guards only to dismiss them in disgust. She smiled during executions, not from cruelty but from curiosity, to see whether death could make her feel something. And yet, none of it worked. The palace was too perfect, too polished, too sterile. There was no dirt, no danger, no heartbeat. So she created Loba, the she-wolf, a name whispered in the dark corners of the Subura, a shadow self she could wear like a second skin. When night fell, the Empress of Rome stripped off her jewels, smeared her face with ash, and slipped into the labyrinth of Rome's underworld. There, she was not Augusta. She was prey, hunter, and ghost. To the world, she was the paragon of purity. To herself, she was an echo trapped in a marble hall, a divine figure choking on her own divinity. Power had made her untouchable, and untouchable meant unalive. The cage of gold was closing in, its hinges oiled by silence. She could not breathe, and soon her rebellion would take form, Not in politics, not in murder, but in flesh. The flesh was the only thing Rome could not sanctify, the only realm still her own. To understand Messalina, one must first understand her lineage, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the poisoned root of empire. Her ancestors were gods and monsters wrapped in the same toga. Augustus, the saviour. Tiberius, the recluse. Caligula, her cousin, the living disease of Rome, who waged war against the sea, collected seashells as trophies, and demanded worship in the temples of Jupiter. She'd grown up watching madness not as punishment, but as privilege. In her family, cruelty was a language, and paranoia was survival. Children learned to smile while their parents plotted. Poison was served with dessert. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, taught her that love was dangerous and beauty was currency. Her tutors drilled her in poetry and politics, but the real education came from the dinner table, watching guests drink cautiously, waiting for someone to fall. When Messalina was 15, she was married to 50-year-old Claudius, a match designed not for affection, but for consolidation. The dynasty needed heirs, Claudius needed legitimacy, and she needed escape, but escape never came. Claudius adored her with the dull devotion of a scholar. He gifted her estates, jewels, and power over petitions. He trusted her completely, and that trust was the first mistake of his reign. At 17, she bore him a son, Britannicus, the future of Rome. The birth cemented her place, but it also locked her in. From that moment, she ceased to be a woman. She became an institution. And institutions do not bleed, do not laugh, do not desire. The palace corridors became her echo chamber. She heard voices of her ancestors, whispers of Tiberius on Capri, drunk with paranoia. Caligula laughing as he slit throats in his garden. Livia, the Iron Empress who poisoned her way to power. Was she their descendant, or their reincarnation? The line between inheritance and possession blurred. She began to believe that her fate was not her own, but the continuation of something ancient, a sickness passed down like divine blood. Power ran in her veins, but so did rot, and when rot meets beauty, the result is always fascination. Messalina's allure was not just physical, it was the reflection of empire itself, magnificent, irresistible, and doomed. She understood instinctively what Rome adored most, spectacle. So she became one, every gesture calculated, every smile a weapon, every word a trap. She could destroy with kindness or command with silence. And behind every act of cruelty there was something worse, boredom. To Rome she was the embodiment of grace. To herself she was the last flower growing from poisoned soil, and soon she would bloom, blood red, radiant, and fatal. Messalina's power matured like venom, subtle, perfumed, and efficient. At first, she played the political game with elegance. Rivals were removed quietly, wrapped in legal decrees and signatures. Julia Livilla, Caligula's sister, executed on false charges of adultery. Seneca, exiled to Corsica for daring to speak too beautifully. Threats erased not with daggers, but with ink. But victory brought her no thrill. To rule through paperwork was to drown in tedium. She craved not order, but chaos, the kind that made hearts pound and crowns tremble. So she turned the palace into her theatre. The stage was marble, the curtain gold, the audience terrified. Senators' wives were summoned under pretense of devotion to the Empress, only to be forced into acts they would never confess. Messalina did not need pleasure, she needed surrender. Her delight came from breaking what appeared unbreakable. She wanted to see dignity collapse, to watch the proud become animals under her gaze, to control not just bodies, but the soul that resisted. She could make virtue kneel and faith dissolve. She could command desire like a general commands war. Rome whispered her name with both horror and awe. To the men who adored her, she was Venus reborn. To the women who feared her, she was Nemesis in silk. And yet, beneath the spectacle, there was no joy, only the steady descent into numbness. She had reached the summit of domination and found only silence there. Every new act had to surpass the last. Every scandal had to outshine yesterday's outrage. Her mind, sharpened by boredom, turned creativity into cruelty. She invented new games, secret banquets where morality was mocked, where senators watched their wives traded like currency. She believed she was untouchable, that the empire itself bowed to her pulse, but what she mistook for power was already decay. The philosophers of her time wrote that the gods envy mortals because mortals can die. Messalina understood that envy too late. Immortality, through status, through myth, was the slowest form of death. Some nights, she stood at the balcony overlooking the forum, the city's torches glittering like dying stars. She would whisper to herself, "All of them want to be me, and I want to be none of them." That was the paradox of Rome. Everyone was pretending. Senators pretending to serve, soldiers pretending to believe, gods pretending to care. In that grand masquerade, Messalina was simply the most honest liar. When pleasure lost its taste, she began to dream of danger, true danger, not the rehearsed threats of palace intrigue, but something raw, unfiltered, real. She wanted to feel the city's dirt under her nails, to smell the breath of the mob, to dissolve her identity into the anonymous night. The Empress of the world desired the only thing denied to her, the right to fall. The Subura was Rome's underbelly, a hive of taverns, smoke, and feverish laughter, a place where senators lost their dignity and slaves sold dreams by the hour. To most nobles, it was a pit to be avoided. To Messalina, it was salvation. She slipped into that world disguised as Loba, the she-wolf. A common harlot with a cheap blonde wig smelling of wine and oil, skin powdered with dust from the streets. She paid her attendants to cover her absences, bribed guards to look away, and vanished from the marble world above. The first time she entered the Subura, the shock was almost holy. The noise, the heat, the stench, it felt like life. Men didn't bow, women didn't whisper, no one cared about titles. For the first time in her life she was invisible. But invisibility is addictive. Each night she returned, walking deeper into the labyrinth of alleys where the Empire's filth fermented. She learned to curse, to spit, to bargain for her own body. She was both actress and addict, worshipping the illusion of freedom. And then came Scylla, the reigning courtesan of Rome, famed for her endurance and arrogance. To the prostitutes she was a legend. To Messalina she was a challenge. One night, amid the roar of drunk sailors and flickering lamps, Loba issued the invitation. A contest, a duel of bodies, 20 men, one after another, the kind of game that made even the Subura hush in disbelief. Scylla accepted, thinking it was mockery, but she did not know her opponent's identity. The night stretched into madness, moans, laughter, and exhaustion merging into something unholy. The crowd shouted, counted, gasped, and when Scylla finally collapsed, broken, Loba kept going. 23, 24, 25. When dawn bled into the room, Loba rose victorious, her body trembling, her eyes blank. She had proven nothing to anyone but herself. Back at the palace, her servants bathed her in milk and gold dust. The Empress of Rome re-emerged, radiant, untouched, as if the night in the gutter had been a dream. But something inside her had changed. The mask no longer fit. She had seen the city from the gutter, and now the palace seemed obscene. The silks felt heavy, the perfume smelled like rot. The marble floors were graves. What she called freedom was, in truth, infection. The thrill of filth clung to her like scent, intoxicating, inescapable, and fatal. And in the silence of her chambers, Messalina smiled faintly. For the first time she had beaten the gods at their own game. But she did not know that the gods were already watching, sharpening their knives. Out of the ruins of her indulgence a new obsession emerged. His name was Gaius Silius, the most beautiful man in Rome, broad-shouldered, eloquent and doomed from the moment their eyes met. He was a senator, a consul designate, admired by the city for his discipline, his virtue, and the kind of beauty that made even statues jealous. Messalina saw him during a ceremony in the forum, standing among the marble pillars, sunlight cutting across his face. He looked like the embodiment of everything she had once loved. Strength, youth, danger. But more than that, he looked alive. For a woman trapped in the ritual of power, that was irresistible. At first, it was curiosity, the way a queen might toy with a flower. She invited him to dine, surrounded by musicians, incense and wine older than the Republic. He came, reluctant but curious, knowing refusal meant offence. The first conversation was polite, the second was dangerous. By the third, he was lost. Silius knew the cost. To lie with the Empress was to sign his own death warrant. But when Messalina touched his hand, trembling not with lust but with despair, he saw not an Empress, but a soul on fire, burning her way out of the palace walls. Their affair was reckless. They met in hidden villas, under moonlight, in the shadow of statues depicting virtue. She sent him gifts, imperial rings, chariots, even servants belonging to Claudius himself. She was no longer hiding, she was flaunting. The palace whispers became thunder. Courtiers stared at the ground when she entered. The Senate murmured that Rome had a second king, and Silius, drunk on proximity to power, began to believe it. He divorced his wife under Messalina's command. He moved into imperial estates. He wore robes embroidered by her own hand. The Empress had created not a lover, but a mirror. In Silius, she saw the youth and vigour that Claudius lacked. In her, he saw the throne he could almost touch. Together they created a fantasy, a Rome reborn through passion, unchained from senile caution. But fantasies have gravity. Theirs began to pull everything down. Messalina grew bolder. She appeared beside Silius in public games, smiling as if nothing were amiss. She arranged feasts where senators toasted them both, pretending ignorance out of fear. She danced in his villa, drunk, laughing that she could replace the old god with a new one. And then came the ultimate blasphemy, a wedding. Messalina demanded marriage, not secret, but sacred. Claudius, she reasoned, was away inspecting the grain fleet in Ostia. The empire could not run on an old man's size. Rome deserved passion, renewal, and blood. She would make it official. In Silius, ambition devoured reason. He agreed. Whether out of love or madness, he stood beside her as priests recited vows meant only for mortals. The ceremony was lavish. Witnesses, dowry contracts, garlands of roses. The Empress of Rome became the bride of her own destruction. And somewhere in the palace shadows, the freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, listened, pale with terror. They knew what Silius did not. The empire was not ruled by Claudius, nor by Messalina, but by the bureaucrats who managed both. If she replaced the emperor, their heads would fall first, so they made a choice. They would destroy the woman who had made them rich. The wedding was no secret. It happened in daylight, attended by senators, priests, and courtiers, pretending not to tremble. To some, it felt like a dream. To others, the end of the world. Messalina, radiant in white silk and gold embroidery, walked down the aisle not as a bride but as a goddess reclaiming her own divinity. Her laughter echoed through the atrium like prophecy. Silius, handsome and trembling, placed the ring on her finger, a gesture that sealed both their fates. Rome gasped, but Rome obeyed. No one dared stop the Empress. For her it was logical. Claudius was aging, absent, replaceable. The empire needed vigour, youth, passion, and Silius was all those things. She saw herself as a restorer, not a traitor. The gods, she believed, had chosen her to renew Rome in her image, but while the bride celebrated, the palace machinery began to turn. Narcissus, the emperor's most cunning freedman, moved with the precision of a viper. He gathered witnesses, forged reports, and sent riders down the Appian Way toward Ostia, where Claudius was supervising the grain ships. When Narcissus reached him, the emperor was seated among scrolls, hands stained with ink. "Your wife," he said slowly, "has married another man." Claudius blinked. The words made no sense. He laughed nervously, thinking it a jest. "She has married," Narcissus repeated, "the consul designate Silius, before witnesses, with a dowry." The laughter died. Claudius froze. The man who ruled the world could not rule his own disbelief. Narcissus saw the hesitation and acted. "If you return slowly, they will kill you before you arrive." "You must ride now." What followed was chaos wrapped in discipline. Horses saddled, torches lit, the emperor's convoy slicing through the night toward Rome. Every mile tightened Narcissus's grip on power. Every heartbeat dragged Messalina closer to the blade. In Rome, the celebration turned to dread. Rumours spread that Claudius knew. Guests fled in silence, leaving garlands scattered like corpses across the floor. Silius sobered too late. He He urged Messalina to flee, but she refused. "I am still his wife," she said. "He will forgive me." But even as she spoke, soldiers were marching up the Palatine Hill. When Claudius entered the city, he no longer looked like the scholar of marble busts. He looked like judgment itself. His first order, "Bring me Silius." The young consul was dragged before the Senate, still wearing his wedding tunic. He didn't plead innocence, only for a quick death. He got his wish. Steel flashed, the body fell, and Rome, ever hungry for tragedy, waited for its next course, the fall of the Empress. Messalina ran barefoot through her gardens, the scent of wine and roses turning to panic. The Empress who ruled through humiliation was now the hunted, choking on her own terror. Above her, clouds gathered. The gods had accepted the offering. The wedding of death was complete. The sea breeze at Ostia carried the stench of fear long before Claudius reached Rome. He rode in silence, the reins trembling in his old hands, his mind split between disbelief and betrayal. Behind him thundered the Imperial Guard, their faces grim, their orders clear. By the time the convoy entered the city gates, the news had spread faster than the horses. Rome was no longer whispering, it was holding its breath. In the palace, the freedman Narcissus had already seized command. He knew Claudius's weakness, hesitation, and filled it with his own strength. To preserve the emperor's dignity, he crafted a narrative. Messalina had betrayed the gods, Rome, and her husband. Her death was not punishment, it was purification. When Claudius arrived, exhausted and confused, Narcissus met him at the gates with forged evidence. Letters, witness testimonies, lists of participants in the mock wedding. Each parchment was a nail in Messalina's coffin. "She is no longer your wife," Narcissus whispered. "She is Rome's disease." Claudius said nothing. His face, pale beneath the laurel crown, was unreadable. That night he dined alone. His cup was filled with watered wine, his plate untouched. When a servant entered, he asked softly, "Has she come to beg forgiveness?" "No, Caesar," the servant said. "Then perhaps tomorrow," Claudius murmured. But there would be no tomorrow for her. Meanwhile, Messalina was in flight, barefoot, her golden bracelets clinking like shackles as she ran through the gardens of Lucullus, the only place left untouched by her corruption. She clung to her mother, Domitia Lepida, her voice breaking with terror. "Help me," she cried. "Speak to him. I can still explain." But Domitia's eyes were cold, sharpened by decades of imperial survival. "You cannot explain to a man who's been made to feel foolish before the world," she said. "Your only mercy is to die quickly." Messalina didn't understand. She was still the empress in her mind, still the woman whom Rome obeyed. But power, once stripped away, disappears faster than breath. Narcissus sent word to the Praetorian Guard. "Do not wait for orders." In the palace, Claudius hesitated again. His voice wavered. "Let her come to me," he said. "Let me hear her." Narcissus bowed and ignored him. He knew that hesitation could undo everything. The tribune Evidus, grim and efficient, led a detachment of soldiers through the gardens. Torches flickered against the marble statues. The empress who had ruled through fear now hid among the trees like prey. When they found her, she was kneeling before a statue of Fortuna, goddess of luck, the same deity who had once favoured her. "Your life is over," Domitia said. "The only thing left is to die well." She handed her daughter a dagger. Messalina's hands shook. She tried to lift the blade but couldn't. Her courage, once so terrifying in sin, evaporated in truth. Evidus sighed and stepped forward. "Enough," he said. The gladius struck. One clean motion, and silence. The blood of Augustus's great niece soaked into the marble path. The night wind moved through the cypress trees, carrying away the last breath of the woman who had believed herself immortal. Back in the palace, Narcissus entered the dining hall. Claudius was still seated, staring at his cup. "It is done," Narcissus said. Claudius blinked. "Done? She is dead." For a long moment there was no sound. Then Claudius nodded. "Bring me wine," he said, "and tell her to dine with me when she returns." Narcissus froze. The emperor had already forgotten. The scholar who ruled the world had lost his mind to silence, and Rome, ever eager to consume its monsters, prepared to erase her name. The gardens of Lucullus were once a paradise. fountains whispering over marble, peacocks strutting through cypress groves, the scent of myrtle heavy in the air. Built by a general who had conquered the East, it was said that Lucullus had imported luxury itself into Rome. It was there, in that temple of pleasure, that pleasure itself came to die. Messalina sat on the damp earth, her gown torn, her crown lost somewhere among the roses. Her once perfect hair hung like vines around her face. The Empress who had commanded senators and seduced gods now stared blankly at the ground, her fingers digging into the soil like roots trying to return to the earth. Around her, soldiers waited, disciplined, silent, uncomfortable. None dared speak her name. Even now, stripped of her titles, she radiated something terrifying, the memory of power. Her mother stood nearby, distant but unmoving. "Do it yourself," Domitia said quietly. "At least die as your ancestors did." Messalina raised the dagger. The blade caught the moonlight, reflecting her trembling hand. Her lips parted as if to pray, but no words came. Her whole life had been noise, laughter, applause, moans, screams. But now there was only silence. She pressed the point against her throat. For a heartbeat she hesitated. She wanted to live. She always had. Then the sound of armour broke the air. The tribune Evadus stepped forward, face cold as marble. "The Emperor has given no command," he said, "but Rome has." He gave a nod. A soldier moved behind her, a flash of steel, a gasp, a dull thud. The she-wolf of Rome died not with a roar but with a sigh. Her blood ran down the marble steps, pooling beneath the statue of Fortuna, the goddess who had once smiled upon her, now staring down in stone indifference. Domitia closed her eyes, not in grief, but in calculation. She knew the ritual of erasure would begin before dawn. When the soldiers left, they carried nothing, no crown, no jewellery, no body fit for burial. Messalina was not granted the funeral of an empress. Her corpse was thrown into a shallow grave, covered hastily with dirt and weeds. No prayers, no torches, no mourning, only the wind. Back in the palace, Narcissus stood beside Claudius, who ate dinner in silence. The freedman reported, "It is done." Claudius nodded, his voice distant. "Good. Let her come to supper soon." The room fell still. The Emperor's mind had fractured under the weight of betrayal. Messalina's name was never spoken again in his presence. Her statues were smashed, her portraits burned, her name carved out from inscriptions as if she had never lived. The Senate issued the final decree, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. The Empress who had ruled the most powerful empire on earth was now nothing more than an absence, a void in marble, a silence in the archives, a ghost without a name. But even silence can echo. In the brothels of the Subura, the legend of Loba lingered. They said sometimes, on nights when the moon burned red, a woman cloaked in gold and shadow would walk the streets again, not begging, not seducing, but searching for the one thing she never found in life, an end that felt like freedom. When the sun rose over Rome the next morning, the city was quiet. The air that once carried the laughter and rumours of an empress now smelled of rain and marble dust. Servants swept the palace corridors in silence, erasing blood, petals and whispers alike. The woman who had turned pleasure into rebellion was gone, reduced to a forbidden syllable. Emperor Claudius sat alone at his table, the same table where Messalina had once entertained senators and poets. His cup of watered wine trembled in his hand. He had been told of her death the night before. He had nodded, said nothing, and gone to sleep. Now, as dawn broke, he asked the question that made his courtiers shudder. "Why is the Empress late for breakfast?" No one answered. It was not cruelty that drove his words. It was emptiness. His mind, cracked by shock and shame, had sealed itself away from grief. He was an emperor who ruled everything except his own heart. The scholars who later chronicle that moment would argue over whether Claudius truly forgot or merely pretended to. But perhaps the truth was simpler. Some losses are too vast to be faced head-on, so the mind chooses amnesia over agony. Within days the Senate convened. They voted on a motion as old as Rome's cruelty, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Her statues were dragged down and shattered in public squares. Her face was scraped off coins. In the archives, scribes carved her name out of stone tablets until the grooves bled white dust. It was a second execution, colder, more thorough and everlasting. Messalina's villas were seized, her servants interrogated, her friends banished. Her son, Britannicus, was forbidden to speak her name. Even the paintings that had once adorned the palace walls, her likeness in purple silk, her hand resting on a laurel branch, were repainted to show an anonymous woman. The woman who had once felt too visible now became invisible by decree. But history has a habit of defying erasure. The Romans thought they had buried her. Instead, they created a legend. In taverns and theatres, in whispered stories told by torchlight, her image re-emerged, distorted, dangerous, irresistible. Some called her the she-wolf of Rome, others the whore Empress, others still a martyr to her own hunger. Each retelling turned her from a body into a symbol, and symbols never die. For decades after her fall, courtiers would glance nervously at the portrait niches left empty in the palace, the spaces where her statues once stood. They said the marble seemed colder there, as if remembering what had been torn away. Narcissus, the freedman who engineered her death, soon discovered the curse he'd unleashed. He had removed the Empress only to make room for another, Agrippina the Younger, sister of Caligula, mother of Nero. Compared to Messalina's storms of passion, Agrippina was ice. Calculation replaced chaos. Manipulation replaced lust. Rome had traded wildfire for frostbite. Under Agrippina, Claudius would die by poison. Nero would rise and the empire would burn. The cure had proven deadlier than the disease. Centuries later, when the ruins of Rome were dug up and the broken faces of its forgotten rulers uncovered, one fragment stood out, a piece of marble with a woman's eyes carved wide open, her lips slightly parted as if still gasping for air. Scholars argued it was Messalina's. Others said it was too beautiful, too human to be hers. But perhaps that was the point. For all her sins, Messalina remains Rome's mirror, reflecting its appetite for power, for spectacle, for beauty consumed and discarded. She was not its corruption, she was its confession. The Empress who slept with 25 men in one night did so not out of lust, but to feel something beyond marble, beyond worship, beyond the suffocating perfection of empire. And in that madness, she revealed Rome's own secret, that beneath every golden statue lies a human heart, desperate to break free, even if freedom means ruin,